So right now I'm kind of obsessed with this fantasy series. You may have heard of it. It's about a hot vegetarian vampire who's moody and Byronic and tortured, and he also has great hair. He hides his condition from the protagonist at first, and then slowly starts opening up about his dark, mysterious past. He hates that he's been turned into a monster with great hair, but he hungers for human blood. Yes, I did start playing Baldur's Gate 3.
There in the dim firelight, you see him for what he really is.
Say it.
A vampire, a slave to sanguine hunger.
I have some bad news. I regressed back into my Twilight era. Like, you can't tell me the scene isn't Twilight coded as hell. If Twilight wasn't written by a conservative Mormon mom from Scottsdale, Arizona.
You want to be known, to be tasted.
Like, the things I was about to say about him, this is pixels, okay? This is not a real man.
Anyway, just hear me out.
Dance upon the stars tonight, smile and pain will fade away.
I know I'm a little late to the hype train, but I've been playing what is probably an unreasonable and quite frankly concerning amount of Baldur's Gate 3. This fucking game is ruining my life.
It is getting in the way of the way I live.
For the uninitiated, Baldur's Gate 3 is a Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game that came out about 6 months ago and kind of surprisingly became a smash hit. It was the follow-up to a computer game that came out more than 2 decades ago, based on a niche 50-year-old fantasy tabletop game. It also kind of defied current gaming industry trends. As a CRPG with a steep learning curve and a staggering $100 million plus budget to create 174 hours of cinematic cutscenes. Not to mention, as a choose-your-own-adventure game with branching storylines, it's extremely resource-intensive and inefficient to produce so much content that most players won't ever see. And that's why it's so good. Like, there's a reason this game has gotten so much critical acclaim, swept all the major industry awards so far, and was on everyone's Game of the Year lists. So naturally, I found myself constantly thinking about the game. At work, I would play the soundtrack in the background to motivate myself during the day, and on my breaks, I was scrolling Baldur's Gate TikTok. I think part of the reason Baldur's Gate 3 is so compelling is because the degree of choice and agency you have in the game feels unparalleled. Baldur's Gate, which I've heard described as D&D without the math, has some of the best storytelling I've ever seen. Not just in a game, but period. Also, as a former teen Twilight girly and a huge fan of Buffy, as soon as Astarion revealed himself as a vampire and tried to bite me in my sleep, I'm sorry, but I immediately let the man suck me dry.
I wasn't going to hurt you. I just needed, well, blood.
Like, you catch him attempting to drain you in your sleep, and if you choose to do him a solid and not kill him, he has the absolute audacity to ask you if he can keep going. So of course I immediately said yes.
Do you think you could trust me just a little further? I only need a taste.
I'm sick. I have not been this way since middle school, since Twilight.
Now watch what happens if you don't force him to stop or if you fail a dice roll.
It's all over.
Something terrible's happened.
This fussy little fuckboy fully drained the life out of my body, and I was like giggling, twirling my hair. That's so fine. So fine. Also worth noting that the second this man meets you, he pretends to be your ally and then immediately pulls a knife to your throat. Anyway, I'm obsessed with him. I mean, one of my favorite newer Disneyland rides is Rise of the Resistance in Galaxy's Edge because animatronic Kylo Ren yells at you. I don't know how to change at this point. I'm just like this. Anyway, a little attempted murder between friends aside, as the game progressed and I played through Astarion's entire story arc, I realized how deeply upsetting this fictional vampire man's storyline was. I think he's not only one of the most compelling vampire characters in recent years, but his storyline is an extremely impactful, layered depiction of a queer male abuse survivor. So in an effort to stop hyperfixating on this fucking game and this bitchy little vampire twink, I'm gonna do a deep dive into the hot vampire trope in the modern vampire canon. Now that I'm a foremost vampire scholar / expert, we're gonna look at the trope through the lens of Baldur's Gate 3's themes of vampire generational trauma and bodily autonomy. Before we start, I do think it's important to note that Astarion delivers some of the most devastating reads in the entire game.
I really thought Shadowheart and Lae'zel might fight to the death over that artifact. A pity.
So here's the video that literally no one asked for about the internet's favorite bloodthirsty 200-year-old baby girl. If you're not familiar with the game or D&D, and for some reason you're still choosing to watch this video, here's some necessary context. In the opening scenes of Baldur's Gate 3, you learn that the character you play as, whose default name is Tav, has been infected by a parasite. The parasite gives you mysterious telepathic powers, with the small caveat that it will probably eventually turn you into a mind flayer. Mind flayers are classic tentacled baddies in the D&D universe. Just think Davy Jones in Pirates of the Caribbean, it's kind of that. All of the other companions in your party, including Astarion, have also been infected by these parasites. So you decide to band together to try and find a cure to becoming what you assume is a horrible tentacled monster that loses all sense of identity and agency. We'll come back to this later, but keep in mind that freedom of choice and agency is the primary theme for all of the playable characters in the game. We don't learn much about Astarion's background pre-Parasite at first, only that he's supposedly a magistrate in the city of Baldur's Gate, and it's all very tedious. We do know that the parasite embedded in his brain gives him the ability to walk in the sun and avoids some of the negative side effects of vampirism. Astarion's default D&D class is Rogue, which means he's great at stealthing through the shadows, stealing, and breaking into places he shouldn't be.
Do you know how easy this is for me? Do you have any fucking idea how easy this is? This is a fucking joke. And I'm sorry you can't do this. I really am, because I wouldn't have to fucking sit here and watch you fumble around and fuck it up.
Initially, he's super vague about his origins and keeps you and the other companions at arm's length. But to be fair, that's also true of most of your party. Almost all of your companions are constantly hiding things from you and basically acting like a bunch of Scorpios, with the exception of sweet baby Karlak, who's never done a single thing wrong in her life. In most playthroughs, Astarion will not readily tell you that he's a vampire, and you only learn of his sanguine tendencies when you catch him trying to bite you in the middle of the night. In fact, he goes out of his way to hide his condition because people, quote unquote, don't trust vampires. So worth noting from the very beginning, he is playing you like a bard plays a lute, if you will. Like Louis in Interview with a Vampire, or Edward from the acclaimed literary masterpiece Twilight by Stephanie Meyer. Astarion lived for 200 years as the vegetarian equivalent of a vampire, or the non-vegetarian equivalent of a human. During this time, Astarion only feeds on animals, but worth noting that this isn't really his choice. Rather, his former vampire master wouldn't allow him to feed on anything other than rats.
I ate whatever disgusting vermin my master picked.
Being a pretty rat girl is actually really hard, so let me explain.
If you're down bad like me, you can allow him to bite you to help him become stronger and more useful in combat. He says this means a lot to him, and it positively impacts his relationship with the player.
This is a gift, you know. I won't forget it.
But letting him bite you comes with a temporary bloodless debuff the next day. The following day, Astarion also confesses that he's never bitten another person before.
You were my first.
Stop. After allowing him the opportunity to feed, he'll start opening up to Tav.
I was a slave, a vampire spawn, kept by the Tsar family. But now, I've been conveniently lost. They won't ever control me again.
Kids, could you lighten up a little?
And as you progress through Act 1, you learn more about his condition and how he was turned into a vampire spawn by his former master, Cazador.
I suppose you want to hear about Cazador.
Let's fucking talk about Cazador.
Cazador.
He has some pretty old ideas about things.
We should get some slaves.
Cazador Czar is a powerful vampire lord in Baldur's Gate. After Astarion is attacked by monster hunters over an unspecified ruling he passed as magistrate, Cazador finds him dying in the street and offers him the gift of eternal life. Astarion agrees, but Cazador conveniently fails to mention that undeath will come at the cost of his personal agency and free will.
He didn't mention the slave clause at the time.
As a vampire spawn, Astarion lacks the power of a full-fledged vampire.
I'm sure a vampire spawn could still rip out your throat if he felt like it.
And until the parasite, he was physically incapable of defying his master's commands. At the campfight that triggers in Act 3, we can see that Cazador's other spawn have glowing red eyes and are being forcefully compelled by the vampire lord. Even from a considerable distance, Cazador's influence over his spawns is inescapable.
Do you know the power a vampire lord possesses? He can change shape, turn into mist. He could walk into our camp tonight and kill you with his bare hands. And you'd be lucky if death was the worst thing that happened to you.
Astarion and the rest of the spawn are also regularly forced to submit to brutal acts of torture. When you visit Cazador's palace, Astarion will tell you that for alleged bad behavior, he was forced to sleep on the ground in a dog kennel.
He used to lock me in a cage. What the fuck? No, that's a true story.
In the 5th and current edition of D&D, vampires as a race are especially prone to what are called dark desires, such as greed, pride, and wrath. Cazador is especially obsessed with power and the ability to dominate and control others. On a nightly basis, he forcefully compels Astarion and the other spawn to lure attractive victims back to his palace to feed on.
Hey, do you want me to kill that guy for you? Because it sounds like he sucks, and I will totally kill that guy for you.
As a way to wield his power over his vampire slaves, he keeps them in a state of near starvation, only allowing them to feed on the occasional insects or vermin. Rats frequently show up in vampire narratives. Dracula can compel a legion of rodents, and rats are typically depicted as being less satisfying to feed on than humans.
Never fully satisfied.
The blood of small animals might not heal a vampire to full strength, and a vampire feeding on them is usually depicted as a degrading or humiliating act. In the blood source hierarchy, rats and vermin are basically at the very bottom. In addition to the weird rat stuff, Astarion will show you a strange set of scars on his back. We learn that Cazador physically carved infernal runes into his spawn's flesh, a painstaking act of mutilation that lasted the course of an entire night.
He made a lot of revisions as he went.
You later find that the devil language on Astarion's back is part of the rite of profane ascension that Cazador intends to perform to basically become the most alpha vampire of all the alpha vampires. But in order for Cazador to ascend, it requires the sacrifice of all of his spawn, including our favorite pretty rat girl. Astarion's primary goal in the game is to kill his former master and finally gain his freedom. But he also grapples with the promise of power that the ritual holds if he's somehow able to perform it himself. As soon as he learns about the rite of profane ascension and what it can mean for him as a victim of abuse who's still not safe from his abuser, he's basically just like,
I want that.
In modern storytelling, vampires are nearly always inherently sexualized.
I felt its breath on my face, and then its lips.
I lived through the height of Twilight fever. In high school, I devoured Interview with the Vampire, and I'm obsessed with Viago from What We Do in the Shadows.
Oh, it's a spinal column, yuck.
And because I'm an equal opportunity bisexual with years of built-up Catholic guilt, I was also tuning into the low-budget lesbian vampire web series Carmilla every week when it went up on YouTube, because I have mommy and daddy issues. So, you know, no one gets the vampire craze more than me. But vampires weren't always Riz Kings. European vampire myths from the Middle Ages described vampires as bloated, decomposing corpses with purple skin. You didn't simply stake a vampire to prevent it from rising from its coffin, but also to pierce the skin to deflate its bloated body. So hot. One of the earliest modern vampire myths in English literature was introduced by John William Polidori in his short story, The Vampire. Published in 1819 and based on Lord Byron himself, the eponymous vampire Lord Ruthven is described as beautiful and pale with dead gray eyes. He's a witty aristocrat who's kind of mean, but women, they absolutely love his vibe.
His peculiarities caused him to be invited to every house, in spite of the deadly hue of his face, which never gained a warmer tint, either from the blush of modesty or from the strong emotion of passion. Though its form and outline were beautiful, many of the female hunters after notoriety attempted to win his attentions and gain, at least, some marks of what they might term affection.
There are a lot of thirsty people around here.
To the Ruthven simps, he isn't just the run-of-the-mill, pasty white boy intellectual who's just waiting to gaslight them. I mean, yes, to be clear, he is all of those things. But his condition of being a vampire, his monstrousness, is emphasized as a specific quality that humans are drawn to. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, not to be confused with Bram Stoker's Dracula, the human character's reaction to vampires is often read as an allegory for Victorian sexual repression, in which vampires are simultaneously represented as sexually enticing and repulsive. But I mean, Bela Lugosi could kind of get it. Jonathan Harker, who is Dracula's 20-year-old solicitor/kept boy, suffers a nervous breakdown after 3 hot vampire ladies try to seduce and feed on him. It's not completely clear whether this event happens in reality or serves as an extension of Harker's unrealized sexual fantasies.
All 3 had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing, and at the same time, some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips.
Dejan Kuzmanovic notes Harker's struggle with his repressed sexuality and his non-normative vampire fantasies in 1890s Victorian England. He He writes, away from his fiancée, from the moral and social norms of England, Harker's ego loosens control over his desire. He wants to be illicitly kissed by no less than 3 women. I mean, who amongst us doesn't want to be illicitly kissed by no less than 3 women? Just wondering, just asking questions. In the 90s, the film and TV canon changed the public conception of vampire lore in a big way. During this time, the line between monster and human gets increasingly blurred. There are a lot of shitty men in a lot of the vampire depictions I talk about, so if you see an actor from a movie and think, wait, isn't this person a piece of shit? You can just go ahead and assume that I also think that. In 1992, we have Bram Stoker's Dracula, not to be confused with Bram Stoker's Dracula. Coppola updated the vampire archetype with a Count Dracula that fucks, falls in love, and cries tears of blood when a woman dumps him. He's still monstrous in his many forms, but he's able to project a younger form that women unfortunately dig. I kind of hate Gary Oldman as Dracula, but I don't have time to get into the Gary Oldman of it all. Despite being a villain, Dracula has more emotionality than earlier iterations. You really get a sense of the vampire's interiority, both in private moments and with Jonathan Harker's fiancée Mina. This is a Dracula who yearns, who pines. He also experiences shame about his monstrousness. He takes on a decidedly younger, more human form when trying to charm Mina, and gets so embarrassed by his horrible, reprehensible actions and the idea of her seeing him as a monster that he compels her not to see him. He's not so embarrassed that he actually stops acting like a monster or, assaulting people, but he still makes the effort to hide it from his crush. He just kind of wants to keep it on the DL. Similar to the book, Mina's sexual purity is contrasted with her friend turned vampire Lucy. Lucy is the more flirtatious and sexually experienced of the two, as is her God-given right, and because she's a member of the aristocracy, she's more brazen with her advances towards potential suitors. Lucy is also more easily seduced by Dracula and experiences more violence because of it. She takes off her cross necklace, she's compelled by Dracula in what I can only describe as his beast form. My girl is sinning left and right, she's acting like a godless heathen, and she becomes a vampire with a tragic ending because of it. Mina, on the other hand, is a chaste Victorian woman who basically does all the stuff women were supposed to. She has a committed fiancé who writes her love letters, she bristles at depictions of sex like she's supposed to, and she initially rejects advances from men who she doesn't know like she's supposed to. But still, she eventually succumbs to Dracula's charms. Though she's kind of able to save his soul at the end by helping him find God before she cuts off his head. But he still assaulted Mina's best friend, got her brutally killed, and tortured her fiancé. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that's maybe not a great look. I just know in my heart that that man is not seeing heaven. An Interview with the Vampire, which more or less feels like the blueprint for Twilight. You can't tell me that Stephanie didn't watch the 90s movies and go, let's do the same thing for Eclipse and Breaking Dawn, but in a less interesting, more chaste way. Louis is a grieving widow who was preyed upon, attacked, and turned by the vampire Lestat at the lowest moment in his life. Anne Rice was basically like, what if a vampire was a little squeamish? Babygirl is just so delicate, he couldn't possibly drink an innocent human's blood. Though the 1994 film tones down some of the homoeroticism apparent in the book,
Lestat must have wept when he made you.
It's still 123 thrilling minutes of Sailor Moon looking ass vampires doing shit like this. In the series, the act of desiring and consuming blood replaces and intermingles with the desire for sex. In Anne Rice's canon, vampires don't conceive of intimacy in the same way as humans. And with the exchange of bodily fluids, the creation of a new vampire becomes a violent, deeply intimate, and erotic act. Seduction is the vampire's primary tool in luring their victims, meaning their errant desire to feed on humans is inextricably linked with their sexuality. So perhaps that's why so much of the vampire canon features some form of celibacy. Vampire mythology frequently creates a dichotomy between the evil, sexy vampire, Exhibit A, Nosferatu, all-time #1 hottie, and the good-natured celibate vampire who suppresses their sexual and vampiric urges. Because vampire sexuality is intertwined with an unquenchable bloodlust, sex is often equated with a lack of control.
It's almost impossible to stop.
In Dracula, women who succumb to the undead nobleman's charms are turned and physically compelled by his powerful hypnotic influence. In the first 2 seasons of Buffy, Angel, who's a 241-year-old vampire cursed with a human soul, falls in love with vampire slayer Buffy Summers. Inappropriate age gaps in human vampire relationships aside,
For one thing, you're like 224 years older than I am.
When Angel and Buffy sleep together for the first time, Angel's curse is lifted and he turns into a soulless monster that relentlessly harasses Buffy. After Bella and Edward abstain from sex for 3 whole books, the couple marry and finally consummate their relationship in Breaking Dawn. And what do you know, Bella immediately becomes pregnant with a half-vampire spawn that devastates her frail human body. She's forced to drink human blood to satisfy her baby's vampiric thirst, literally dies a horrific, violent death during childbirth, and is repeatedly bitten by her husband, setting into motion her painful transformation from human to vampire. Within the vampire canon, consummating a human-vampire relationship often has grave consequences that lead to a temporary or permanent loss of control and bodily autonomy for one or both parties. Although vampire narratives frequently involve traumatic physical transformations, coercion, and abuse, Baldur's Gate 3 feels somewhat unique in the amount of space and thoughtfulness it devotes to the trauma of being a vampire.
I remember how it hurt when I turned into a vampire.
As a survivor of hundreds of years of physical and sexual abuse, Astarion understandably holds a lot of contradictory ideas about sex. His bodily autonomy was violently taken from him by a vampire lord who forced him to use his sexuality to lure victims. In several cutscenes, Astarion indicates that he spent the last 200 years of his life disassociating during what is essentially vampire sex trafficking. In what is, in my opinion, one of the most haunting scenes in the entire game, Astarion shares what was done to him when he formed an attachment with one of Cazador's victims and tried to save his life.
I found a darling boy who I couldn't bear to bring back to him, so I ran, instead of hurting that sweet man.
Astarion shares that, as punishment, Cazador sealed him alone and starving inside a dusty tomb for an entire year.
So don't you ever judge me for doing what Cazador ordered.
In his attempts to brainwash him, Cazador repeatedly drills into Astarion the idea that his only value is in his ability to seduce targets. Sex has been wielded as a weapon against him, and he internalizes the belief that sex can and should be used as a tool to manipulate others. So it makes sense that in situations when he feels unsafe, he'll sleep with people to gain alliances and try to get the upper hand. If he has a high enough approval rating of Tav, Astarion will pretty quickly try to seduce you. And though it might not be immediately clear at first, he has ulterior motives for doing so. If the player romances him, he'll later admit that he initially has sex with you as a way to manipulate you into forming a tactical alliance, so you'll quote-unquote never leave him. I can't believe I'm a 30-year-old woman who got played by a fake pixel man on my screen. This is so embarrassing. Players will also probably notice that the man brings up sex and makes sexual innuendos a lot.
I do mean sex, to be clear.
After Astarion escapes his master, he continues to do the seduction act in order to gain alliances. But it's also clear that he understandably has a lot of discomfort with sex. There's actually a scene when Tav has the opportunity to invite Astarion to have a foursome with 2 other elf sex workers. Yeah, because why not? And he pretty clearly dissociates the entire time. I think it's also worth looking at the way Astarion responds to stress in moments when he has to quickly respond to a perceived threat. Throughout the game, Astarion's choices are primarily motivated by a sense of survival and self-preservation. When a person feels threatened, the body defaults to an automatic stress response, which includes fight or flight, as well as freeze and fawn. And they come up a lot during conversations about abuse because people who experience trauma or have PTSD commonly develop an overreactive trauma response, which makes it difficult for the body to deactivate the sympathetic nervous system after the threat has passed. Wait, do vampires even have sympathetic nervous systems? There's simply no way of knowing. But Astarion notably often defaults to the lesser-known 4th stress response known as fawning. Fawning is a common reaction to abusive family situations or abuse that occurs over a prolonged period of time. This makes sense within abuse dynamics, but for a lot of survivors, fawning becomes an instinctive response in situations where there's not actually any danger. Personally, this feels really relatable to me as someone who sometimes still struggles with this. A lot of survivors of familial abuse have trouble setting boundaries and establishing their own sense of identity. We see this in scenes when Astarion indicates he's uncomfortable with doing something, but continues to be persuaded by other characters. In Act 2, you meet a drow named Mirage who immediately outs herself as a freak with a vampire fetish. She then uses dehumanizing language and objectifies Astarion, who in turn struggles to say no when she tells him to bite her. He politely, if not anxiously, declines, but her requests become demands. The player can decide to stand up for Astarion, who is clearly uncomfortable, or ignore the discomfort and persuade him to bite the drow in exchange for a reward. In my playthrough, I obviously stood up for him because I'm not a fucking monster, and it's kind of sad how thankful he was afterwards. Like, the man threw himself at me because I called him a person? Honey. No. However, for the sake of the noble art of the video essay, here's what happens if you push him to go through with it.
Fine. I'll do it.
Though clearly still uncomfortable, he immediately shifts into fawning behaviors, abandoning his own needs and putting on a show of flattery to appease her.
After all, who could resist such a delectable neck?
Only afterwards does he realize that biting the drow was extremely triggering for him. He doesn't expect to have such a strong emotional reaction, but being coerced into an intimate act with someone he finds repulsive reminds him of the countless times Cazador coerced him into sexual encounters he didn't consent to. The player will rightfully lose approval points with Astarion for crossing his boundaries and pressuring him into a situation he felt he wasn't allowed to say no to.
And you pushed me.
And then he will absolutely dump your ass. What I like about this scene is that it depicts consent and coercion in situations that aren't inherently sexual, showing how daunting it can be for a victim of abuse to reassert their needs in situations where their boundaries are being ignored or violated. One thing I really appreciate about Baldur's Gate 3's writing for Astarion is that you get to see him slowly learn how to establish boundaries and navigate conflict. He's like, oh, you're casually manipulating me? No, we're absolutely not doing this. And I think that's great. Which leads me into the next scene I want to talk about. So say you didn't pressure Astarion into biting the creepy drow. In a conversation directly following that encounter, when he thanks you for standing up for him, there's a dialogue option to try to convince him to sleep with you as a reward. What I didn't mention earlier is that if Tav romances Astarion, he'll ask to take time to heal and process his trauma before he can feel safe enough to be intimate again. So by choosing to pressure Astarion, you're ignoring the boundary he set after he just told you how hard it is for him to set boundaries. Again, didn't choose this option because I'm not a fucking monster. But the scene that follows this dialogue option is absolutely devastating.
I didn't know how to say no, but I do now.
Y'all, I thought I was playing a video game, not the saddest, most fucked up thing I've ever seen. In conclusion, here's why Larian should cover my next therapy session. Like, the impact of holding a PS5 controller in my hands as a character in my game says,
this is all a game to you, isn't it?
I mean, I thought it was. I've truly never played something that convinces you firsthand that it's probably bad to coerce a man who doesn't want to have sex with you into having sex with you. There's something just so deeply unsettling about witnessing a video game that shows players that a character has trouble setting boundaries and then gives them very real in-game consequences for violating them. Personally, I'm thankful that Larian didn't show the explicit scene because the direct aftermath feels more effective to me. I've watched way too many shows that depict graphic, extended scenes of sexual assault for entertainment at the expense of viewers who experience similar violence in their own lives. Interestingly, Baldur's Gate 3 was actually one of the first games to bring in intimacy coordinators to film its many romance and sex scenes. Due to the difficulty involved with depicting so many different scene variations and outcomes, and the significance of those scenes in an RPG like this, it was important to have dedicated coordinators working with all of the actors involved. Neil Newbon, the actor who plays Astarion, has also been vocal about his experience as a survivor of sexual assault and the extensive work the studio put into handling his character's story with care. When you finally get to visit Cazador's palace in Baldur's Gate, I'll be honest, it's low-key terrifying, but it provides a lot of insight into the cultural practices, we'll call them, passed down from generation to generation of vampires. In Cazador's private chambers, players will find the skull of Velioth, Cazador's sire and former master. Clamped between Velioth's jaw is a scroll describing the lessons he taught Cazador and that Cazador later impressed upon Astarion. A set of rules passed down from sire to spawn is common in vampire lore, like the Great Laws in Interview with a Vampire, or even the Ulterior laws that Edward explains to Bella in the Twilight saga. These rules can be based in tradition or self-preservation, and they're usually things like requiring spawn to obey their masters or forbidding vampires from churning children. Most notably, Velioth's lessons reveal that he enacted years of horrific abuse on Cazador as a spawn, mirroring Astarion's experience.
Velioth's first lesson is always to dominate. Allow none to be your equal.
While Cazador was enslaved by Velioth, he reached out to a former friend he knew prior to being turned. We don't know if he reached out for help escaping or simply desired companionship, but Velioth forced Cazador to watch as he murdered his friend in front of him and sucked him dry. Velioth's first lesson fulfilled the dual function of illustrating his dominance over his spawn and further isolating Cazador from any pre-existing support systems.
Velioth's second lesson is that power comes from solitude. To share with others is to be weak, and to be weak is to fail and die.
Though the details are unclear, we learn that Cazador once tried to rebel against the Vampire Lord and was severely punished for it. Except the punishment he received wasn't for rebelling in the first place, but because his act of rebellion was unsuccessful. In order to demonstrate his second lesson, Velioth made Cazador endure 11 horrific years of impalement. Velioth's lesson parallels the year of solitary confinement Astarion suffered when Cazador sealed him, starving inside of a coffin for his failed escape attempt. Within the vampire cycle of abuse, there's no greater sin than weakness, which then must be eradicated with violence and torture. Velioth's final lesson highlights the importance of exacting a slow, calculated plan of attack on a vampire's enemies. Cazador learned this lesson by brutally killing his sire and boiling his flesh from his skull, a preserved memory that Velioth recalls fondly, which is very Sith Lord of him. Considering the vampire cycle of abuse, is it really any wonder that so many vampires are angsty, brooding, and hate themselves?
This is the skin of a killer, Bill.
The overwhelming desire to drain innocent victims, like Elon Musk drains Diet Coke cans and Twitter's net worth aside, vampires are basically groomed into believing they need to be sadistic, unempathetic, tyrannical monsters. Sure, monsters don't have a lot of say in their nature, but the culture of enslaving, torturing, and brainwashing certainly doesn't help. This is also making me think a lot about the way that artificial family dynamics are replicated within vampire lore. Cazador is described as the patriarch of his coven, and he repeatedly calls his spawn his children. He uses infantilizing language, referring to Astarion, a 239-year-old man, as boy and child. The Tsar family is also a literal family lineage of vampires. And there's a whole side story where you learn that Cazador turned his own niece at the age of 13 without her consent. Incidentally, she was kind of a badass because she rejected the whole creepy family cult thing, changed her name, and refused to ever leave her room. Honestly, queen shit. In real-life toxic family dynamics, abusive parental figures often think of their abuse as serving a greater good. In the minds of many abusers, corporal punishment functions as a way to correct perceived mistakes and reinforce desired behavior in victims. The schemas passed down from vampire masters to their spawn are inherently rooted in a cycle of abuse. In vampire mythology, including Dracula, Interview with the Vampire, and Buffy, vampire lineage often requires that all vampires are both victim and predator. The original trauma of being preyed upon by a monster who has power over them, viciously attacked and turned against their will, is part of a cycle of violence that gets repeated every time a vampire feeds or creates another vampire. In many of these narratives, the dichotomy of vampire versus prey, master versus spawn, mirrors the abuser-victim dynamic. So kind of weird that in Twilight, Edward and Carlisle are completely chill about it. Nothing but a father and son playing baseball with absolutely no tension, trauma, or lingering resentment whatsoever. Even after Astarion is able to escape and resist Cazador's control, the impact of centuries of sustained abuse lingers, distorting his thoughts and behavior. Throughout the game, Astarion attempts to reject the weakness he perceives within himself, the so-called weakness that Cazador tried to torture out of him. He's obsessed with becoming more powerful, and is attracted to the Ascension ritual because he thinks it means he'll never be vulnerable to abuse again. But the toxic belief system that Astarion internalized seems most apparent when he's forced to confront his past victims in Act 3. His main questline involves breaking into Cazador's palace, and in doing so, he comes across several holding cells that Cazador kept secret from him and his siblings. Inside these cells, he finds thousands of starving, feral vampire spawn living in decay that he knew nothing about. If you thought Cazador was simply killing all of those victims he made his spawn bring him nightly, surprise bitch, he wasn't. In order to complete the rite of profane ascension, Cazador is required to turn and sacrifice 7,000 souls to the Lord of Hellfire, Mephistopheles. Just a small detail he may have forgotten to mention. Men will literally sacrifice the souls of 7,000 vampire spawn to the Lord of Hellfire, Mephistopheles, instead of going to therapy. Initially, Astarion is repulsed by the neglected spawn, until he realizes that he recognizes many of the faces in the cells as former targets he seduced and brought back for Cazador, 1,000 victims he thought were long dead. One of his first victims, a man named Sebastian, tells the story of how Astarion got him drunk at a tavern, seduced him, and brought him back to Cazador.
You were handsome, shy. You'd never been kissed.
You taught me how, and then you destroyed me.
Though Astarion was physically incapable of resisting Cazador's orders, and he makes a lot of deflecting comments about it,
I may have done that.
he's clearly overwhelmed by guilt and shame. And I'm so sorry for this tangent, but does this not kind of have the energy of Shrek with lowered ears? Anyway, Astarion is also quite repulsed by the condition the spawn have been left in for centuries, describing them as pathetic and horrible. When you confront Astarion about this, saying he might be projecting just a little bit, he gets really defensive, and I think his response is telling.
That weakness in me is dead. It's dead!
Astarion judges Cazador's imprisoned spawn particularly harshly because he's struggling with his own internalized beliefs about victimhood and weakness. His instinctive reaction is to blame the spawn for what he perceives as inadequacies, because he sees himself in Cazador's neglected victims. In Act 3, Astarion's main questline culminates in him confronting Cazador and having to make the ultimate choice, sacrificing 7,000 spawns so he can become the vampire Ascendant, or saving them and remaining a spawn forever. The role of choice is the primary theme running throughout Baldur's Gate 3, but it's also a major recurring concept within vampire narratives. In Twilight, Bella spends 3.5 long-winded books begging Edward to turn her, to allow her to exercise her choice and become a vampire. And he just keeps edging her. There's a lot to be said about Bella's motivations for this, and whether or not her desire is valid or rooted in a teen girl's struggle with identity. The books don't really grapple with the weight of that choice in a satisfying or intellectually curious way, but it's undeniably a substantial part of the text. In Interview with the Vampire, after mortally wounding Louis, Lestat presents him with the choice he never had.
I'm going to give you the choice I never had.
But the so-called choice that Lestat offers his targets isn't really a choice at all. Mortally wounding someone and then offering them the option to become a vampire or die is a false dichotomy of choice that Lestat manufactured to suit his own needs.
If I leave you here, you die.
Like, sir, have you ever considered the third option of not bringing your targets right up to the point of death and instead simply letting them go? He targets Louis because he knows he's emotionally vulnerable. Louis, grieving the loss of his wife and daughter, behaves recklessly because he actively wants to unalive himself. He begs for death, but when the moment comes, he hesitates.
Have you tasted it enough? Enough.
Lestat promises that the gift of darkness will rid him of pain and grief, and Louis agrees, but only reluctantly. When Astarion first meets Cazador, his experience mirrors Louis'. He's similarly bleeding to death when he's given the option to die or become a vampire, a choice he references with a degree of sarcasm.
Eternal life or bleed to death on the street.
Cazador also leaves out some pretty major details about the consequences of being a vampire spawn, and it's doubtful Astarion would have actually consented to being turned had he been informed of them. I think it's also pretty clear in the way that Astarion talks about his experience that the process of being turned was a major source of trauma for him, and not something that he would choose a second time.
I don't want to turn into anything else.
I think it's also clear in the language he uses to describe his experience that he does not enjoy being a vampire. He pathologizes vampirism with medical euphemisms, describing it as a condition, complication, and affliction. Even Cazador himself seems to struggle with the monster he eventually became. If you use detect thoughts while Cazador is asleep in his coffin, his thoughts betray an eerie internal monologue that's really telling.
I sleep but cannot rest. I live but cannot die. I am eternal, and I grieve.
I mean, that's pretty messed up, dude, but once again, bars. And I know I'm not saying anything revolutionary here. Oh, vampires hate themselves, can you believe? But I think it's important to consider Astarion's feelings about being a vampire when looking at his choice between remaining a spawn and ascending. What is his internal reasoning behind choosing one or the other? When Astarion finds the imprisoned spawn, he's hesitant to help them. Partly for good reason, because suddenly releasing thousands of feral, starving vampire spawn into the world, it's tricky. But also because saving them means he won't gain the protection he believes the Ascension will promise. He won't have the abilities of a true vampire, only the negative consequences. When he loses the temporary protections granted by the parasite, he'll no longer be able to walk in the sun, condemning him to a life in the shadows. And he'll be left relatively unprotected from enemies. From a story perspective, I think Ascension is the wrong choice for Astarion, but I can understand why in this moment it would be so intoxicating to him. On the other hand,
Yeah, people are gonna die.
going back to the idea that Astarion's choices are motivated by self-preservation and survival, he's like so adamant about wanting to perform the ritual, even if you've previously tried to convince him otherwise. You might even have the instinct, as I did, to give the Pixel Man agency and let him make his own choice for the first time in 200 years as a little treat.
I'll be free. Truly. Completely free.
But a successful insight roll contextualizes Astarion's desire for ascension.
You can see the fear in his eyes, but also the hunger. The thick smell of blood in the air and the promise of power being so close is intoxicating to him.
Consider the context in which Astarion is making this decision. He just had to fight his abuser who enslaved him for the last 200 years, and he said some pretty fucked up shit to him.
You are a small, pathetic little boy who never amounted to anything.
No! Shut up!
There's blood and viscera and dead bodies everywhere. He's surrounded by Cazador's victims, including the 1,000 or so he just learned existed and now feels responsible for. My man is so traumatized right now. He's described as being intoxicated by the smell of blood and decay around him. And because there's an active threat in front of him, he's not capable of making a true choice at that moment.
We sure this is a good idea?
No matter what, he's going to be instinctively drawn to whatever option he assumes will give him the most safety. And maybe this sounds like I'm projecting or reading way too much into this, and I am. But that's also what my guy literally tells you after you talk him down from ascending.
All I could see was the power on offer and the safety it promised. I was so blinded by it.
The man is not thinking straight. Astarion tells you that he could feel something slipping away, that he came close to completely losing himself. He also thanks you for saving him from Ascension, mirroring his dialogue in Act 1 when he thanks you for allowing him to bite you.
This is a gift, you know.
The other reason why I'm anti-Astarion ascending is because it completely changes his personality and motivations.
The very composition of my blood has been altered.
Unlike Astarion's Spawn ending, in which he'll go on to search for a cure for vampirism, if he gives into the pursuit of power and signs a deal with the devil, he becomes power-obsessed. Instead of trying to find a way to walk in the sun and manage his constant hunger, Ascended Astarion's focus shifts to creating his own coven and gaining influence in Baldur's Gate. He starts viewing other people as prey waiting to be dominated.
All the lowly creatures of this plane are begging to serve.
Even after Astarion defeats Cazador and becomes the Vampire Ascendant, he still tries to embody his abuser's ideals and behaviors, and by extension, the rules of vampiric existence. He wants to control others, enslaving them as vampire spawn, and to continue the cycle of abuse that he himself suffered. I found this interesting because some survivors of parental abuse unconsciously replicate the same behaviors and ideals from their own abusers. That's why you sometimes see generational trauma passed down within families from abusive parents to their children to their children's children. Astarion's romantic relationship with the player also morphs into this weird power dynamic thing. And like, I get it. You can actually have him turn Tav into a vampire spawn, but it's pretty clear that he will then start thinking of you as a subordinate. This scene still kind of hits though.
I can't wait to taste your lips after you've tasted me.
But mirroring his transformation from human to spawn, Astarion's ascension fundamentally changes who he is as a person.
Something tells me he's not the same person we knew.
And what I think is so interesting about Baldur's Gate 3 is that it presents players with the complicated choice between persuading Astarion from making a decision that would clearly damage his progress healing from abuse, and letting him make his own quote-unquote choice to ascend. To me, persuading Astarion not to go through with the ritual and save the imprisoned spawn is an essential step in the character's healing journey. Instead of rooting his aspirations in the twisted ideals that Cazador and the vampires before him glorified, this decision shifts how Astarion views himself and who he identifies with. Truly seeing and valuing the spawn's humanity is Astarion choosing to identify with Cazador's other victims and honor the humanity within himself. By aligning himself with the spawn, it means he too is a survivor worth saving. It means choosing to be better than Cazador, choosing to form his own identity, and choosing to break the centuries-long vampire cycle of abuse. And that's really powerful. But of course, you can also choose to let your pansexual elf boyfriend double down on becoming a toxic alpha vampire who wants to rule the world. Some players actually prefer letting Astarion ascend and live out his fantasy as a kinky vampire top, creating a polycule of spawn submissives. In Baldur's Gate 3, you can make whatever choice you want. That's kind of the whole point.
There are a lot of thirsty people around here.